Thanks so much for joining us on the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. We're going to get to today's episode in a minute, but first, I want to tell you about the Art of Leadership Academy. Imagine being a church leader and not just guessing about your next steps in leadership. Imagine breaking through your personal and church growth barriers. Imagine getting unlimited access to all of my premium courses and those of other leaders. Imagine having a community that's coaching you and connecting with over 1,300 leaders who are leading growing churches from across the country and around the world. And all of that for less than the price of attending a conference or even hiring a consultant. All that is yours in the Art of Leadership Academy. Click the link to check it out. Hope to see you inside. And now to today's episode. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's great. So you're editor of Entrepreneur magazine, as an occasional reader of that. I really appreciate what you do. You obviously profile entrepreneurs left, right, and center. And I'd love to start on a broader level. What are some of the differences you've seen between entrepreneurs who make it and businesses that fail? Because it's something like 70% of all businesses, I don't know if that's apocryphal or true, fail in the first 5 years. Similar stat for church plants. There's just a lot of failure going on. So what are some of the broad stroke differences you see between the successes and those that don't make it?
I think actually you teed up the answer really nicely by bringing up that stat. So the stat, which I may butcher a little bit off the top of my head, but I believe that it is that 50% of businesses do not survive past the first 4 or 5 years. But here's the thing. People often take that statistic and they say, well, that means that 50% failed. But that's not true because, first of all, just because something didn't last longer than some arbitrary amount of time doesn't mean that it didn't succeed in what it set out to do. And actually, so the statistic comes from the Census Bureau, and they surveyed and found that there's some pretty decent percentage. I think it might have been a third of the people who folded up shop in that time period had actually accomplished their mission, whatever it was. They had set out to build something for some amount of time, and it worked. And then maybe they closed it because it was done, or they sold it, or they passed it along. Whatever it was, it had succeeded really. But we only see it as failure because we're measuring success in one limited way. And then also really important is to know, and this is not in the data because it would be just so hard to track, but just because a business fails does not mean that the person behind the business failed, right? That's an important distinction because you really, when we operate in the world of businesses, and I know much less about the world of churches, but I would imagine this to be true, is that sometimes the act of building something, even if it doesn't quite work out, will teach you exactly what you need to know to be successful the next time. And that oftentimes the great success actually comes directly out of the thing that failed, whether that is because the thing that failed drove you to meet somebody who became a great partner or gave you an idea for something else. Very famously, Stuart Butterfield was running a failed video game company and then said, the chat functionality inside of this video game is pretty useful. Maybe that is a product by itself. And that became Slack. And so I think that the difference, to go back to your original question, of what either drives success or drives what I would say is true failure is, I think, the right kind of persistence. The wrong kind of persistence is to say, I started this thing and I will be devoted to it until the end of days. And because sometimes you actually need to walk away from something. You need to say, what I've built here doesn't really work, but I am now first in line to have a better idea of what will work. And it is that adaptability and that willingness to rethink, to be wrong, to know that what you are doing is simply setting you up for something that comes next rather than is something that just needs to be protected at all costs. That is the thing that I think ultimately drives success.
That's a really helpful clarification. And I guess I have to do some due diligence on that church planting stat too and drive a little. But it's funny how so many things get accepted as axiomatic that maybe are not true. And I think you're right. I mean, Abraham Lincoln would be considered to be a failure up until the very twilight of his life. I mean, just tried so many things that didn't work out, didn't get election, was not very popular, and then changes history. It's amazing, right? What was it? One of my favorite quotes is Winston Churchill. Success is moving from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm.
That's a great quote.
It is a great quote.
And this, again, I'm probably going to have it a little bit wrong, but I think that the story goes that as Thomas Edison was trying and at that point failing to invent the light bulb or the first commercially viable light bulb, that somebody asked him if he felt like he had wasted his time, and he said, "No, I figured out 10,000 ways it doesn't work," which is useful. Right, and we should be really mindful that it often comes down to how do we define success, right? Because we are often, I mean, we don't do this intentionally, but if you step back and think of it, we are often defining success based on someone else's definition of success. So if I release a book, as I did, this book, Build for Tomorrow, which I will tell you, to my at least mild disappointment, was not a number one New York Times bestseller, but that really is only a disappointment if I decided that was the definition of success, right? It is other people's definition of success. There are certainly plenty of people who release a book purely for the purpose of having it hit the top of the bestseller list. And if it didn't do that, it's not a success. But that's their definition. It doesn't have to be mine. And I think that the more that we are really mindful of how we are defining success for ourselves, the more we do not get discouraged when we are not meeting someone else's expectations.
No, that's a really good framing. I was listening to an interview just recently, the latest one with Tim Ferriss and Seth Godin, and Seth's been on the show a couple of times. But what I didn't know about Seth is, he hit a number one New York Times bestseller, and he goes, well, that's it. I'll never match that again. And then he's subsequently released other books, many of which have gone on to do well, but one of which sold like 14,000 copies, which is, not way better than most books. But when you're number one on the New York Times list, that's disappointing. And thank goodness Seth kept going. Thank goodness he didn't quit. So on that note, how do you have a framework that you see in entrepreneurs who are wisely able to call when an idea is a bad one and you need to shut it down and run away, or hey, we're just, moments away from our critical breakthrough? Because I think that can be a hard line. Sometimes you're, riding a dead horse. That's what you're doing.
It's an incredibly hard line. And it's funny, I was just yesterday, I was having breakfast with some executives at Techstars, and we were talking about exactly this, because it's something that founders, and I think anybody, grapples with all the time. And here's why: because there is a selection bias happening in the stories that you hear. Because, for somebody, if you hear somebody on a podcast, if you read their book, whatever, then they went through some setbacks, and I hope that they're able to honestly talk about them, but their perseverance led to their success. And so the lesson that they will often have to offer you is persevere, grit, stick with it. How many times have I heard, and frankly published, because at Entrepreneur Magazine I have that power, published stories from people who say 100 investors told me no, and I just kept going, and then I finally reached success, right? You don't hear from all the people who heard no from 100 investors, and those investors were right. You don't hear that story. But you should, because the problem is that look, persevere, but know what you are persevering on. Know what the project is. And sometimes the project is the thing that you're building. Sometimes the project is you. And the thing that you're building it has an expiration date, but it will teach you something that will help you build your next thing. And how do you know the difference between the two? I actually just had a conversation about this with a woman named Annie Duke, who wrote a book called Quit. It just came out. It's very good. And she's her area of study is how people make decisions. And she said, well, I mean, she said a lot of great things, but two that I'll share with you right now to answer that question. Number one, she said, it's really helpful to think of everything that we do this way. What would happen if the first person you dated had to be the person you marry?
Great question.
Yeah, right. Because
divorce.
Right, well, yeah.
100%.
But also not a lot of dating, right?
Right.
That, not a lot of dating, not a lot of trying, not a lot of exploring, not a lot of figuring out what you need, because you'd be terrified, because the first date you go on you got to lock it in. And so the reason why we are able to hopefully find the right person for us is because we can quit a lot of other relationships first. And so Annie says, look, we are dating ideas. We are dating pursuits. We are dating concepts. We are dating businesses. We are dating churches. We have to make sure that we leave open the possibility that we have to walk away from this, because sticking with something that does not work is robbing you of time that you could devote to something that does work. And so how do you know? I asked her. And she said, well, look, one of the best things to do is, I think she called it, I could have this wrong, but I think she called it a kill criteria, which is basically set some benchmarks. In 6 months, it should be looking like this. In 9 months, we should have this kind of growth. If we don't, I need to seriously consider the possibility that this doesn't work. Right? Work towards something and then see if you can hit it or not. And then be very honest about what that means.
Yeah, that's good advice. And it's funny, as we're talking, I'd mentioned Seth Godin. I've asked him that question on this podcast, and I'm pretty sure his answer was a variation on his minimal viable audience. Like, tell 10 friends, and if it goes nowhere and they don't tell anybody, that's a clue. And just see how your idea spreads, right? But a lot of us, it's like, I got the idea that's going to change the world. And then 10 years later, nothing's happened. Super helpful. By the way, I loved your book. I thought it was great. And, you and I read a lot of books for our living. That's what we do. And I was shocked at how many stories in your book I just never heard of, because I've read, not, vociferously, but fairly widely. And often it's like, oh yeah, I know that story. Oh yeah, I know that story. I did not run into too many familiar stories in your book, and they were fascinating, like historical examples of ideas that didn't work or ideas that didn't catch on or entrepreneurs that made it. You were not pulling from the stereotypes. No. Can you talk about your research for that? Because I thought it was really intriguing.
Yeah, I am so grateful that you said that, because it was something that I care deeply about. Yeah. As a guy, my background is media. I started as a local newspaper reporter, like community news, and eventually I got into magazines, and I made my way through the national magazine world, and then landed at Entrepreneur. But as a result, my programming is for originality. I want to make sure that I'm offering something that people haven't seen before. We don't publish we don't publish stories in Entrepreneur Magazine that have already been published elsewhere. What would be the point? Everything's got to be fresh and new, and that's how I see everything that I do. So, the problem, and I'm not knocking people. Everyone has a different profession, but a lot of the books that you read out there are not written by people who are in the business of making media, and therefore they're not interviewing people. They're kind of working off of what sort of existing information, and I don't care that much about existing information. So what I do is I talk to people all the time. And I find a million different reasons and opportunities to. Now, it's easy for me because I have a magazine that I edit. So I'm talking to people for that, and for the podcast that I host, and for all sorts of reasons, interview people on stage. And I just sort of compile these stories. I tend to filter, and I think this is useful for anybody, not just, in my kind of rarefied space, but the things that connect with others are going to be the things that resonate with you. So if if you find that somebody said something and you just want to repeat it to other people, and then you do repeat it to other people and they react to it, that's a pretty good indication that you've got some really good insight, and you should refine it and think more about it and tell that story again and again and again. It will get better over time because you'll find the new beats and you'll see somebody react to it, and maybe sometimes you'll bring their reaction into the way that you tell the story next time. And that's what I do. The book is really the product of years and years worth of interviewing people, and then refining those stories over time, and then figuring out how to string them together. I will tell you. Look, it doesn't matter if you're in media or not, and I understand that almost nobody listening to this is in media, but you should feel empowered to go ask other people questions. I get my best stuff because I am curious about something, and then I find someone who is very thoughtful about it. Like the reason why I have all these stories from history and about how people navigated or resisted changes throughout history. The reason why those are so interesting, I will tell you, is because I got very curious about some random thing. Maybe I saw something. Maybe I saw that there was a national moral crisis over teddy bears in 1907, and I wondered, what is that? And you can find a little bit written about it, but not a lot. And so, well, you know what? The only way to really know it is to just go call people who know these things. And the thing is that there's somebody out there who has thought a lot about any single subject that you are curious about, and they are dying to talk to you about it because they don't get asked about it very often.
It doesn't come up at Christmas. No. Tell me about the teddy bear crisis of 1907 history, prof. Nope.
Right. Nope. They don't care. But because that person spent a lot of time studying that, they are thrilled that anybody else cares about it. And so, whenever I have a curiosity about anything, I just reach out. Even if I don't know what the project is, I'll email somebody and I'll say, hey, hello, linguistics professor. I was talking to my in-laws, and we were, I don't know if this is a word that's going to be familiar to a church-going audience because it's a Yiddish word, but I'm Jewish, and there's this word machatunum. You know what that is? Have you ever heard of that?
I do not. I never did take Hebrew, but a lot of people listening to this may have. So you may have struck a vein there.
Okay, well,
go ahead.
So for those who don't know, so machatunum it's Yiddish, anyway, it is a word that does not exist in English. It is the description of the relationship between in-laws. So, for example, my parents and my wife's parents are machatunum. Right? We don't have a word for that in English.
No, we need a word for that.
Yeah, well,
we do.
I mean, we have machatunum. I guess people could pick it up. But, years ago, I can't remember. We were talking with family, and both my parents and my wife's parents like using that word. And we realized nothing like this exists in English. And then I wondered why. And so, it could end there, or I could just go Googling around and find a linguistics professor who I think would have an answer and drop him a line, which is exactly what I did. And I give a fascinating answer, and that fascinating answer turned into, I can't even remember, I wrote some article about it and did some other thing. Like, just reach out. If you have a question, reach out. You will get better information than you will just find on the internet.
And you know what? Professors almost always answer back. And their emails are public. If you can find out where they teach, go onto the website. That's how I've gotten a number of guests, including some legends on this podcast. It's like a little bit of Googling, reach out directly, and I can't think of one that didn't respond. That's incredible advice. Yeah, well, hats off to you, because I read a couple of books a week with what I do on average. Wow. And this one really grabbed me, and I'm like getting a physical copy. So it's really, really good. So, the heart of the book is you see 4 traits in successful entrepreneurs who embrace change. And it's kind of a change management guide, which I think is excellent and deeply needed in the area that I work. Can you outline those traits? Just give us the broad strokes outline of what you see.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so it's not traits so much as phases, but
Sure.
Right. So what I argue is that all change happens in 4 phases for everybody: panic, adaptation, new normal, wouldn't go back. Wouldn't go back being that moment where you say, "I have something so new and valuable that I wouldn't want to go back to a time before I had it." And I really want to stress that this is what everybody goes through, because there are people, you know them, maybe you are them, who seem to roll really well with the punches. Right? So something changes and they're just on to the next thing. And then there are other people who just really struggle with it. And what I have found in spending years and years talking with people who are both good and bad at this is that even the ones who are really good at it, they panic. But the thing is that the more you go through this and the better you get at adapting, the more you move forward with a faith that a wouldn't go back moment is available to you. And if you know that to be true, because you've experienced it enough before, you're able to move through the panic faster, or you utilize the panic in a different way. It stops being a thing that holds you back, and it starts being a thing that fuels you. In which you. I mean, it's the difference between thinking, "Oh no, I'm going to lose everything," and "Oh no, like there's a great opportunity in front of me, and I haven't figured out what it is yet." I try whenever this happens to me to always try to think of it in that second way, right? Like there's something here. It's like in the room with me, and I just can't see it right now, and it's really frustrating, right? But that's a better problem to have than the problem of, I used to do this, I no longer have access to it. I mourn it and cannot imagine life without it. I find that the people who are most adaptable and therefore the most successful are the ones who are just simply moving through these phases faster.
Okay. That is super helpful to know because your life kind of flashes before your eyes. There is the surprise of, this isn't working anymore, or how come this used to work? So one of the things you talk about is disruption and crisis. And I'd love to know, how you see that crisis as being a seedbed for innovation. So, surprise, surprise, 3 years ago, we all hit a crisis and people responded differently. But we're going to hit crises again. We're going to hit personal crisis, organizational crisis, societal crisis, et cetera, et cetera. So looking back on it, what do the people who adapt faster, how do they move through those phases when crisis hits? Like, what are some of the trends you see?
So I think one of the first things that they remember that other people forget is that they're not the only ones going through it. Right? Crisis can be a funny thing, right? I mean, like years ago, right? We all went through the same crisis at the same time. We were aware, this is not breaking news, we were aware that everyone was going through this. But a lot of us were very focused, rightfully so, on our own experience of it. What is this going to mean singularly for me? The oversight there is that when you are going through a crisis, other people are going through a crisis. And if other people are going through a crisis, other people need something. They need new things. And perhaps the people who used to solve their problems are no longer able to. Or maybe they can't afford the solutions that they had before. And this is the kind of moment when incumbents fall, incumbents fall because they're not built for rapid change, because they had a solution that is no longer relevant. And what I find is that the people who are most successful during a moment of crisis are starting to think, you know what, let me put aside my own needs for a second and start to focus on what other people need. Because if I can figure that out, then I know how to be relevant right now. I know how to be useful. I think it was the winners in today's economy right now are the ones who in March, April, May of 2020 said, all right, everything we planned is on hold. I don't care if we make any money off of the thing that we do next, but we better make sure that people feel like we care about them. And so if that means that we're going to give away our product for free, then let's do it. If that means that we just got to start like giving them every possible incentive and gift so that they come use us as soon as they can or whenever it's safe to do so or whatever, then let's do that. Let's keep spending. Let's take care of our people. Let's not lay everybody off right now because you know what? We're going to need them as soon as we figure out how to be useful in this moment. Right? I mean, like, you want to know why your flights have been canceled for the last like 2 years, and it's so frustrating to fly around. The answer is because the airlines dumped all their staff, and then they weren't those people weren't around to scale up when travel came back. So I think when people understand that they are not the only ones going through crisis, they start to make plans based on how to be useful to others, which is ultimately the greatest thing that we all can do. I mean, I know the business world a lot better than I know the church world, but I would imagine that this is a unifying theme between them. And so we need to remember that, and we need to start plotting it out, and we need to be in touch with the people that we serve and understand what they need, not yesterday, now.
Yeah, it's funny. That's an incredibly clarifying lens. And you're right. There are a few groups or organizations that did that spectacularly well. And you're right. They helped a lot of people. They got ahead. When you look back at history, because you have so many interesting stories in the book, can you think of one or two parallel examples from another era or time?
In which somebody stepped up to...
Yeah. There was a crisis, couldn't happen. There was innovation. If it doesn't come to mind, no worries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's funny that, I mean, that... My starting point was thinking about what is something that came out of the 1800s, but actually, I think maybe a better example is something from much more recent history, which was one of the greatest companies to come out of the previous economic crisis, which would have been the recession of 08-09, was Airbnb. And Airbnb, I think, came out of a shifting need and expectation. Right? I mean, Airbnb came out of people's willingness in a moment of crisis to reconsider the impossible. The idea of renting out space in your home, which is how it started, right? I mean, now people have entire homes that they just rent out, but back then it was like rooms. It was like your guest room or your basement. Yeah. And the idea of just opening that to the public market and letting someone come in and stay with you was insane. Nobody would have ever done that. And also on the traveler side, I mean, the idea that I would travel to a city and then stay in someone's guest room, that doesn't make any sense. But then suddenly there was a crisis. People needed cheaper travel options, and they wanted to make money however they could, which meant monetizing things that previously weren't just not monetizable, but nobody even thought to monetize. And out of that moment came a new way to think about hospitality, and it has evolved since. But it was born of. I talked to this guy named Brian Berkey, who's a business studies and legal ethics professor at Wharton. And he said that a moment of crisis forces us to shift the window on the options we are willing collectively to take seriously. And that is what we saw. We saw people shift the window. There was a window in which they said, this is what hospitality looks like, this is what travel looks like, this is what hotels look like. We were now willing to shift that window because what existed in the window before didn't work anymore. And that is what you can see throughout time. I mean, some of our greatest ideas are, a previous pandemic, I can't remember which one. I mean, not prior to COVID. I mean, like possibly prior to the 1918 Spanish flu, gave us public parks, right? Because people didn't have, the idea was people understood that they needed to be outdoors, but urban environments didn't really provide a lot of spaces for people to be outdoors, outside of just being on a street, on a crowded street. And so out of that came an awareness that cities need large public spaces, and we got large public parks as a result. Wherever you look throughout history and you find a crisis, you will find new ideas that take hold.
So one of the challenges for church leaders in particular is obviously we lost access to our buildings, and so did leaders of other faiths as well, right? Everybody lost access to their buildings. And at first I was greatly encouraged. Something like 30% of churches were online prior to the pandemic. Then it spiked to like 95% of churches. But then as soon as a lot, not all, but a lot of churches got access to their building again, they shifted away from innovation and adaptation and back to the status quo, almost to the point where in 2022, there were leaders who are like, well, we're going to shut down or downplay the stream because we want everybody back in the building. And of course, church attendance has been in a free fall for decades now. But I'm wondering from the outside looking in, like any comments to church leaders who might find that online ministry is a threat or that old methods, which weren't necessarily working before the pandemic, might be the easiest and most painless route to follow post-pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, the starting point has to be this. There's no one way to do something. And I understand that, and I imagine that if I was debating a church leader who wanted to get everybody back in, that they would say, and perhaps very rightfully so, they would say that the best experience for the individual, for the community, is in person. How do we know that? Because we've seen it with our own two eyes, but also because that's how it's been for thousands of years. And I'm not here to dispute any of that. That's probably true. But I think the phrase "facts on the ground" comes out of the military, but I like using it a lot. Like, what are the facts on the ground here, right? And if the facts on the ground are that it's very hard to get people to show up in person to something anymore, and if church attendance is dropping, then the solution cannot be to just continue to try to get people to show up at the building. I'm not saying to abandon that. Don't abandon it, but it can't be the only solution because you have the information, you have the facts on the ground. And so we need to start thinking about what else do people need and what do they need now? The most important thing really is to make sure that you are serving other people's needs rather than they are serving your needs. And it could be that your needs are that that the best way to provide the kind of services and ministry that you do is to have everybody in person. Well, those are your needs. It's very similar in thinking. Is I remember I was speaking to a group that had been brought together to kind of workshop the future of work, and we were talking about how managers really want people back in the office, and how the common line here is, well, that's because that's how managers are able to maintain their authority. Because a manager doesn't know. A manager is it's a different role when somebody's not in front. And you can say that, and I've heard that a lot, and that's an interesting and probably very true observation. But it also places blame on the managers. And so somebody in that group had made a really interesting point, which was to back up even further and say, you know what, this is actually a failure of training of managers. Like the managers have only been trained in one way to lead people, and therefore they only know one way to lead people. And what we really need to do is now start thinking about how different can we train managers. And I apply this to what you're describing here too, right? Which is like, I bet that there are a lot of church leaders who believe very deeply. And again, I'm not saying that you're wrong. You're probably right that the best way to serve people is in person. But if that's not how people want to connect right now, or that's not the only way, or they just don't have the time. They also agree with you. It would be great to come in, but they just don't have the time anymore. Well, then the only person that you're serving is yourself in trying to get these people back. And also, what is the problem? Look, it's not even you. I don't mean this to be selfish, but we need to come up with different ways to train leaders so that those leaders can then engage people in different ways. And if you are not willing to meet people where they are, then you only do one thing, which is that you lose relevancy to them. I mean, it's just simply the only thing that happens. Look, again, to take it back to to my area of the world a little bit more is these conversations about should people be in the office, and a really fascinating conversations with leaders who had moved to a 4-day work week. Mm-hmm. So a 4-day work week used to be a crazy idea that was only engaged in academic circles, and then post-pandemic, and everyone has quit their jobs and is saying that they have different expectations now for work, or rather they always had those expectations, but they didn't think that they would be fulfilled, and now they do, that they don't want to come back to the office. And so companies are now experimenting with this 4-day work week, which used to be a crazy idea. Now, what's really interesting is that many companies have found that if they shift to a 4-day work week, and they do it smartly, it takes time, they actually can maintain the same level of productivity over 4 days than 5 days. But about a year in, you'll hear a problem. And the problem goes like this. People will say, I don't feel as connected to my colleagues as I used to. Now, what are you to do with that? Well, here's the thing. I think that if we tend to ask this question of new things. And that question is this perfect? Now, I can imagine a lot of church leaders are looking at connecting people virtually, and they're saying, is this perfect? No, it's not perfect. It's not as good as having everybody in person. And so then we say, well, if it's not perfect, then we shouldn't pursue it. But here's the problem. Nothing is perfect. So if you ask, is this perfect of any new thing? The answer is no, it's not perfect. And now you're going to discard that new thing. And so the better question to ask, and this is what I think you should start asking, what I think church leaders, what every leader of every kind of organization should be asking of every new thing is our new problem better than our old problem? That's a much better question. Is our new problem better than our old problem, right? Because I'll tell you, to go back to churches again, not my area of expertise, but building off of what you've just said, right? If the old problem is church attendance is in decline, then, well, what happens if you mix in-person attendance with some sort of virtual connection as just a starting point, right? Well, is this new problem better than my old problem? I kind of think that it is, because now you have increased the ways in which you are able to reach people and engage people. Now, there are going to be problems. There will be problems. But now you could start solving those better problems. And the solutions that you will be driven towards will also have problems. But this is how we track progress. We track it through problems, not through perfection.
Oh, I'm taking notes because we're 6 months into the 4-day work week, and I lead a virtual company, so that'll be very interesting. We're all gathering here next week for our 3rd in-person of the year, but taking notes. And I love your framing of your needs versus other needs. I've always thought about the needs of the organization versus the mission, but I really love that framing of, are you focused on your needs or the needs of other people? That's even clearer. I can't resist. I got to go to the debate about in-person, like return to the office versus hybrid work or remote work. Where is that dialogue, at the end of 2022, 2023? Because you seem to be at the heart of it. I read from the headlines, but I'd love, because I see that raging with my corporate friends, with church people. Church people definitely like everyone back in the office seems to be the default. Where is that landing in the business community?
So I think we are still, but maybe hopefully at the tail end of it just being a big blinding flash, right? Which is to say there's been a big change and everybody can see that there's a change, but it looks like one big mass. And what will eventually happen is this thing that happens with all changes, which is that like big blinding flash will fade, and you will start to see the nuances because this change is not one thing. This changes many things. And in the case, a perfect example is that a lot of companies are now finding that, it's not that all of their employees don't want to come back to the office. It's that their older employees don't want to come back to the office. Younger employees actually do, because for people in their 20s in particular, the office is a source of social connection. Certainly was for me when I was in my 20s and in my early 30s, where the greatest friends that I made of that time were people that I worked with. And then we would go, to the bar after work. And 20-somethings, a lot of them know that, and they miss that. I mean, I have a friend at Spotify who's very senior at Spotify. So he's in his 40s. He doesn't want to go back to the office, but his 20-year-old colleagues do. And so now we have a really important distinction, right? Which is that it's not that everybody doesn't want to come back. It's that some people don't want to come back based on their life experience. Me personally, I'm 42. I don't want to go to an office at all.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah,
I'm older than you.
and it's for probably the same reason, right? Like we already have our social networks, and we know how to self-motivate, and we know what we're doing, and we've reached a stage in our life where we are more autonomous than we were in our 20s. And so there's just no reason to be in an office. There's just none. And I am grateful that Entrepreneur actually got rid of its office. So there's nobody ever is going to ask me to come back to an office. But I think that what we need to come to is a level of sophistication about understanding people's needs at a more granular level. And once we do that, we can start to figure out how to accommodate those needs and how to make the best of everybody. I talked to this guy, what was his name? Justin Mitchell, who's the CEO and founder of a company called YAC. They make YAC. They make asynchronous meeting software. So in other words, like, how to have a meeting without everybody in the meeting at the same time.
Oh,
and
cool.
Yeah, it's cool. It's through like voice memos and stuff. So anyway, he made this really great point, which was like, look, everybody works differently. Some people are most productive in the morning. Some people are night owls, and their best work is going to happen between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. And we are really doing them and the organization a disservice by making all of those people work the same way. Right? It doesn't make sense if you want to get the best out of your people. It does not make sense to gather a group of people who are naturally going to have different styles of work and then make them work at the same time. Why would we do that? It just doesn't make sense, right? This is very much what I encourage with my team. I mean, I run a fairly asynchronous team. I mean, we're all mostly on the East Coast of the United States, so we're mostly working the same hours. But I don't. If I send somebody a message, I don't care if they get back to me immediately. I don't care if they're out with their kids or at the dentist or working on a side project. I don't care as long as they get their work done, because they're going to get their work done when it is best for them, and therefore, if it's best for them, it's going to be best for me. That's what we need to start to get to. And what does that look like on a grand scale? It looks like not 2019. And not 2022, but it looks like extracting some of the best of both of those times and combining them along with things that we're going to learn along the way.
Yeah, that was sort of my next question too, because I have a very similar approach with the distributed team. It's like, I tell them, I don't care if you work at 2 a.m. hanging upside down, just get your work done and be at the meetings that we agree on, which are not that frequent. So, a lot of autonomy. So the return to the office, even for 20-somethings, is that like 8 to 4, sit at your desk, or does it have more of the flexibility you just hinted at? Like where do you see that going if you're leading young leaders?
It's a great question. I think that one of the most fascinating things about what will happen with the future of work is that it won't look like any one thing across industry. I think that you'll start to see just very different ideas of what work should be. And companies may start competing not just on salary and benefits, but on work style. And so I see it going in a million different ways. But if I was running a large organization right now, and I am not, right? I mean, Entrepreneur is a fairly small organization, but if I was running a really large organization, I think that what I would start to do, I think my starting point would be doing some really deep survey and interview work on my employees, thinking of them as a representative sample of future employees, and asking them what they want and what they need and what they're missing right now. And then start to experiment with solutions. It could be, for example, that people don't want to be back in an office all day, every day. And it could be that when they do come back into you'll see this on TikTok all the time. I mean, I've seen dozens of things that are exactly like this. It's always same video. Young worker, the caption is like, "Come back to the office," they said. "It'll be fun," they said. And then it's just them, right? Like like in a room, in an empty room, And so, right, like, because the problem here is that nobody has thought about what happens next when somebody comes back to the office. People don't want to just be in a room. Nobody cares about that, right? People want connection.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a different way to do that. Maybe actually nobody needs an office, but what people do need is a sort of collaboration space that everybody goes to for a certain amount of time to like work on interesting projects, and you segment that, like the kinds of projects that require this collaboration space are going to happen during these times at the collaboration space. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's that you save your money on real estate and you spend that money on sort of regular retreats, which again, I as a guy in my 40s, I don't want regular retreats. I don't want them. I have kids. That was very disruptive to my work. I don't want to be traveling around unless somebody's paying me a large amount of money to speak to them, which is the reason I travel. So, but like for 20-somethings, when I was in my 20s, I would love regular retreats. Let's do it. It'll be fun. We'll build camaraderie. We'll come up with great ideas. So maybe what we really need is to just start thinking more about individuals and start to come up with some systems and experiment.
Well, the time is flying on this conversation, and it's been delightful, Jason. But you hint at in your book, you talk about the future of publishing.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to mangle this. I'll let you talk about it. But the quote is something like, "I think magazines should get out of the content business," which is really interesting. So please nuance that so it's accurate, and then tell us about, because in many ways you look at, okay, editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur magazine, amazing. It is a great magazine. But yeah, if you want to look at an industry that's just bleeding out over the last 15 years, look at publishing. So like, what's going on, and how are you carving out a future?
So, I appreciate the question. It's totally true. If you want to find a case study for like an industry that just did not prepare despite all warning signs, look at media. It's awful. So okay, here's the thing. I think that this is not a publishing. I'll start with a non-publishing answer, and then I'll use publishing as an example. I think that we all need to ask ourselves this question of everything that we do. Question is this: what is this for? What is it for? What role does it serve? Does it serve a role? Individual actions, ways that we're structuring things. What is this for? You better have a good answer to that question. And the reason why you should keep asking it is because the answer will evolve. I'll give you an example, which is publishing. So people ask me, it's funny, I'll travel around and I'll speak to these companies about how to adapt. And then somebody will inevitably in the Q&A raise their hand and they'll be like, "Okay, adaption guy, but you run a print magazine. So, High from the 1940s, like what is up with that, And my answer is, okay, so look, you ask the question, what is it for, of the things that you do? And then you have to take the answers really seriously. And when I ask the question, what is a print magazine for, or even more broadly, what is content for? Well, if I was asking that question decades ago, pre-internet, the answer was really clear. Content was for monetization. So there were two primary ways to make money off of content. You could sell ads against it, and you could sell subscriptions to it. And those were good businesses. Now, those are hard businesses. Very, very hard businesses. People that, I'm sure that there's an overlapping chart of like magazine subscriptions and church attendance, right?
Some Venn diagrams in the middle, right?
Yeah.
There's a sweet spot,
right? So, that's you could say that's a problem, and then it's harder to sell advertisements into it. And this is not an entrepreneur problem. This is a all media problem, because we're fighting over all media is now fighting over a very small slice of a pie. Because the majority of that pie is being eaten by Google and Facebook. So and TV. So what are we to do? Well, let's ask the question, what is content for if it's not for monetization? And the answer that I have, at least, is that content is for relationships. It's for something. It's for relationships. Because people trust you because of content. They like you because of content. They keep coming back because of content. And they will buy products and services from you because they trust you because of the content. And that, I think, has to be the way forward for media, where you stop thinking about content as the thing that is the backbone of your business, right? Like, you were right when you said we need to get out of the content business because we can't be in the content business. Like the business can't be content, right? You think of Red Bull. Red Bull, if you care about extreme sports, right? If you love people who jump out of airplanes and who do crazy surfing, Red Bull is your place. They have a magazine, they have amazing videos, they have endless events. Do they make money off of that content? I don't know. I would guess they lose money. I don't know. But I know that where they do make their money is energy drinks. And people buy those energy drinks because they feel connected to Red Bull because of the content. So that's how we need to start thinking. And that's how everybody needs to start thinking. What is the thing that you're doing really playing as a role in your ecosystem? Once you start asking those questions, you start to get illuminative but uncomfortable answers, and you better take those seriously. So at Entrepreneur, we're now trying to build out a product suite where what kind of services can we offer. We're at the very early stages of this. It's hard to turn a ship around, but I think that it's the project. Like if we don't figure that out, and again, this is not an entrepreneur thing. If every media company does not figure that out for themselves, then they are dead.
Well, and I'll be anxious to see where that goes. You hint at it in your book if people want more on that, and I'm sure we can follow along with the story. But you're right. I mean, you have incredible brand awareness. Anybody who's got an entrepreneurial gene in their body knows about Entrepreneur Magazine. And then what do you do with it other than just, slide into obscurity, right? Which is so important. Jason, the time has flown. This has been a delight. So before we wrap up, tell us, you're into podcasts, you're editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Magazine. So give us some places where we can discover more of you online and tell us about the book. Yeah,
well, thank you. I really, really appreciate it. What a great conversation. So the book, again, is called Build for Tomorrow. It is available in every format you want, except for Stone Tablet. We haven't gotten there yet, but otherwise, ebook, audiobook, the hardcover, you can get it on Amazon or look for it in your airport bookstore. I love popping into airport bookstores and signing them, or wherever, Barnes and Noble, whatever. Wherever you find books or audiobooks or ebooks, you can find Build for Tomorrow. So that's what I would really recommend checking out. And then if if anybody wants to get in touch with me directly or get more in touch, if you go to my website, jasonfeifer.com, and particularly jasonfeifer.com/newsletter, you can subscribe to my newsletter. And it's a lot of what we talked about here and more. And reach out. I'm super responsive. Carey, I really appreciate your time. It's been really great. I really appreciate this. You have expectations of certain interviews, and this one, it elevated when I read the book, and then elevated even more in the conversation. So this has been a delight. Thank you so much. And thanks for making me think in new categories. I really, really appreciate it. Oh, I no greater compliment. Thank you.